having to basically get up every day and still like answer this call of, am I going to be faithful in the middle of it? Like, am I going to pray for people to be healed when I'm not seeing healing in my home? Am I going to walk away from ministry? Am I going to walk away from what God's called me to do because I'm not seeing what I'm expecting him to do in my life?
Hey guys.
Hey.
How are you doing?
Doing great.
Good.
How are you?
Good. I'm good. All right, so we're doing something a little different this week. We are not talking about what we just heard yesterday. We're going to go back a few weeks because we didn't get the opportunity to talk about when Pastor Darius preached here at Norcross a few weeks ago about the Church of Smyrna. Anyone remember?
Yeah.
Great. Fantastic. So the Church of Smyrna, that was week 4. I'm going to just recap a couple of things just because it was a while ago. But if you recall, the Church of Smyrna was the one that suffered well, right? The Church of Smyrna was a church that didn't bow to the culture. They were known to be countercultural. They were under Caesar's rule in Rome, but they chose to declare Jesus and to stand outside of culture, to stand up for what they believed in. And because of that, they chose poverty. They chose lack of influence. They chose a life of suffering. What does that mean? What does that mean then? What does it mean now? Because that's still a very real thing that we're experiencing to this day. And I think that this is one of those messages that we don't talk about often in the Western culture. We hear it a lot in Eastern culture, but here we don't want to talk about suffering. We want to talk about the car we drive and the meal that we Instagrammed yesterday, you know? So it's not a popular topic.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love to talk about suffering? Yay! Oh my gosh. All right. So this was all out of Revelation 2:8. And Pastor Darius did bring up a couple of points of how do we suffer well. They were understand that Jesus knows our troubles. Do not fear when we are tested, and remain faithful until we triumph. So, again, suffering's not something that we talk about a lot, but do you think, you as individuals, do you think that suffering is necessary as Christians, and have you ever experienced that?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm the middle child, so I want to talk about my suffering.
Me too.
Because nobody had time to listen about my suffering. No, so I think, when I was in the Marines, there was this saying called pain is weakness leaving the body. And while I don't agree with the actual wording, I do kind of agree with the principle that nothing good really happens without you going through some sacrifice and some pain. And so I know, being a parent and raising kids, I find myself saying all these things my parents used to say to me, if you really want something worth having, you're going to have to go through some pain and suffering to get there. And looking back on my life, I don't remember the wins as much as I remember the losses. And those are the things that really kind of shaped me the most.
Yeah. I love that you brought up the parenting aspect of it, and I'd love to hear how that affects you as a parent, because helicopter parenting is a thing, and with social media and all of that kind of stuff, there's so many things that we can protect our kids from, and we want to do that, but also there is some level that they've got to live through. And how do you teach your kids that while still protecting them? That's for you, Aaron.
I was like, feel free to jump in, everybody. Man, if I knew that really well, I would have written a book. But it's difficult. I literally said this to Natalie, my wife, last night. I was like, listen, I have no idea what I'm doing. We're just making it up as we go. And so it's tough because it's so tempting to parent out of fear and wanting to protect, what you value and treasure the most, which, my kids. And you're wanting to keep them from the pain that you've experienced. But I also realized that Natalie and I wouldn't be who we are today if we hadn't gone through what we've gone through. And if we want them to have the strength and grit that they're going to need to do what God's called them to do, we can't win all the battles for them. They're going to have to learn how to take a punch.
Yeah.
And so that's hard
That's right.
to see people you love and care about, to know that you have to kind of sometimes let them struggle and even sometimes let them fail. I would say it's not even helicopter parenting now. Now it's like drone parenting. You're like, you can't see me, and zoom, you just show up. And that's really, it's really hard to resist that wanting to intervene and protect them and keep them from feeling painful things because you love them and you don't want people you love to suffer and hurt, but at the same time, you have to know, like, okay, if I really love them, I have to let them experience some uncomfortable challenges and some heartache and some loss and some pain. And it's so counterintuitive for everything you feel as a father or a mother.
Yeah.
It is. It is, man. All right, Sierra, how about you? Have you experienced suffering? And if so, how has that produced any fruit in you? What has that done for you?
Well, I would take it back to looking at before my walk with Christ began. It was more of you're kind of into the world, you're doing everything the world does. And once you come to Christ, you don't realize the suffering. And I think if as Christians, if we said, oh, you're going to suffer before you give your life to Christ, would we actually be willing to go? Or would we be hesitant,
Yeah.
Would it be like, oh, well, you have to give up this, you have to give up that. But we become so comfortable that it becomes hard. We become attached to things that we shouldn't be attached to.
Good.
And so just stepping into giving my life to Christ, and this was probably, oh my gosh, this was 2010 when I gave my life to Christ.
Yeah.
And looking back on it, just all the amount of just stepping out on faith, trusting God, and being vulnerable, being willing to suffer, and knowing that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing because you're dying to yourself and you're letting God lead you.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what the altars would be like at the end of service if the altar call was, okay, if you're saying yes to a life of suffering, get down here.
Yeah.
Like, what would that do in the room? But at the same time, that's real.
Yeah.
I mean, we can appreciate prosperity gospel all day long, but that's not what Jesus called us to. He says it right here. Like, I'm calling you to a life of suffering, and I'm going to be with you through it. And don't be afraid.
I think that's huge because I think a lot of people think, when they make a decision to follow Jesus, like, okay, God's going to make my life better.
Right.
It's almost like, I just upgraded my life, basically.
Yeah.
Which is true, but it's not the way people think it's going to be.
Right.
It doesn't look like that a lot of times. It's like you're upgrading, but you may not see that upgrade on this side of heaven,
Yeah.
That's good.
So I think, the altars would look different, but it would definitely mature us and make us deeper people.
Yeah. And I think that's essential. What about you, Sam? Experienced suffering.
Yeah, I'm just
As a
like you,
Christian.
middle child, so I know all about it.
Let's get
but
into it.
Let's
I'm
get
also a
into
middle
PTSD,
child.
right? No, but yeah, much like had experienced a lot. But I think back at it now, and I'm like, all of the things that I went through and who I am now. If it wasn't for the things that I went through, I wouldn't be who I am now, right? And so, just back to the question that you asked, is suffering necessary? As much as I hate to say, it's part of your growth process. I hate to say that it is necessary, having to go through the obstacles, the hardships, but what it does in return is just amazing, right? You will never experience or be able to be who you are now if you have never went through the things that you went through, right? So I have a 2-year-old right now, and she's climbing everything. I mean, everything. And I'm suffering in my sleep right now because I'm barely getting any sleep.
That's real.
And so she climbs things, and I'm like, listen, if I don't let her learn that she's going to climb and fall or touch things, I'm not a bad parent, by the way. I'm just saying, you know what I mean? But if I don't let her learn, she's never going to stop. And so she touches things or climb things, and then she'll fall or she'll like hurt herself. She's like, okay, I'm not going to do it again. Yeah. So it's kind of similar to how God does it with us, right? We try to go in our own way, and we fall, and we're like, all right, cool. And God just lets us take those steps. And then he's like, okay, I told you so. I'll do it again, and you learn from that, right? So it's very important. I definitely do think it's important,
Yeah, I agree. I think you both alluded to it a couple of different ways, but something Pastor Darius had a great illustration, I thought, with the seeds. And he held up, and he had a couple of different seeds in his hand, and he asked, what kind of seeds are these? You can't tell by looking at the seed. It has to go deep under the ground. It has to experience the pressure and the dirt and the worms and the things in order to grow. And the yucky stuff, like we don't want to do that, but it's essential for growth. And he said the seed has to be buried and then it grows into something new. He also said God is saying, I don't want you just go through stuff. I want you to grow through stuff. And so have you ever had to grow through a season like that where you felt under pressure, you were in the dirt with the worms, like, I don't want to be down here, Lord. Like, I want to be up there in the sunshine with your beautiful face shining on my leaves and just producing fruit. But the time that was under the ground, have you felt that before? And what did it produce?
And yeah, I mean, so many moments like that, right? I know when I first started in my walk with Jesus, I just, my dad was a pastor, so I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to follow suit. I'm going to start teaching. I'm going to start preaching. I'm going to start doing all of those things. But God was like, it never was natural for me. And what I mean by that is like, I try to follow somebody else's grace. I try to follow somebody else's style. And God was just molding me to be who I was. And so I was in the ups and downs of life. I was in difficult moments. And I'm like, Lord, I can never be up there if I'm constantly in this situation. Like, I need you to take me to, like, upgrade me, first class, right? But I couldn't get there. I had to go through things that I went through. After that season was over, I realized how much impact it had in the ministry that God would eventually bring me to and trust me to. That would happen years later. And so if I wasn't in the downs and the difficult things in the thick of it, I would never be who I am now. And I wouldn't have the impact that I have now, right?
Yeah.
And not to say that it's all on my own, but it's just that the difficult seasons, the hardships, allow me to connect to people in a way that my dad would have never been able to do it, or somebody else would never be able to do it. It's only through my experiences, through those dark moments. And so I'm able to take people out of that dark moment, just like I was at a certain point. And so absolutely, I wanted to be, up top, but can't get up there. You got to start from where you start, right? So it's kind of my thing.
Has anyone that you've encountered throughout that ever acknowledged the fact that you shared that experience with them? Why I'm asking is trauma can be an equalizer for people. And if you have gone through something that someone else has gone through as well, it's a level setting thing for a relationship. And vulnerability begets vulnerability. And so has there been a time where you've shared that, or you've been able to come back on the other side of it to witness to somebody and they've actually expressed what that meant to them?
Yeah, all the time now. It's like, I think the experiences that I went through, now anything that I do now comes from that place.
Yeah.
And so I tend to focus more on my experiences because I know that I can, again, like you said, it's like equalizer. I can relate with people. And so when I talk to people, most of the time what I'm doing is I'm talking about my experiences and what God has done through my experiences, what God had brought me out of and how I'm here now. And so doing so has always most of the time, in fact, when I talk to people, people are always like, hey, I was there. Like, I'm currently in this now and I can relate to that, right? And so that's what I love. Yeah. So of course it is that all the time, man.
Connector. That's good. What about you guys? Have you been down with the worms, under the pressure, getting dirty? What did that do?
I think when you're going through it at first, you don't realize that suffering basically equals growth. Yeah, I think in that moment, you're like, I don't want to be in this, God. Like, why are you taking me through this? What reason?
Yeah.
And usually when I'm going through those seasons, I love to journal because it gives me a reference point to go back to see how God has been faithful, to see what God has done. And sometimes you actually forget what God has taught you in those seasons of roughness.
Yeah.
And it's like at one point I was battling just trust because I am a planner by nature. I'm a control freak. I have to have things planned out.
Yeah.
And God is like, you have to let go and you have to trust me. And I'm like, okay, we'll do that. And then it goes back to, I can't see what you're doing, so I'm going to take this back. And so I feel like in my seasons of suffering, it's been, trust me, I have you. And it makes me think back to being a parent because at certain times, you would tell your kids, trust me, I know what I'm doing. And they second guess all the time.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I have a little story. My youngest, he is 4. He fell on the playground at school. You would have thought he broke his leg. No, it was the tiniest scrape ever.
That's my kid, man.
The tiniest scrape. And so I had to pull his Band-Aid off. And I was like, trust me, just let me pull the Band-Aid off. And he does his whole thing. And so I was like, just let me pull it off. So I pull it off. And then he's like, oh, that didn't hurt at all.
Imagine that.
And I was like, it didn't, did it? And so he's fine. He's running around the house. And then in that moment, I felt like God was like, this is how it is with you. It's like, just let me do what I need to do through you. It does not hurt as much as you think it hurts.
Good.
And it's going to create growth. So the next time it happens, you don't feel like you're going through it. You know that I'm with you.
No,
Good.
that's good.
I've been through just so many different seasons of suffering. Like you, I grew up in a Christian home, parents in ministry, and watched my family fall apart and divorce, and kind of shook everything that I thought I was standing on at that point in my life. Then I had 10 years where I wasn't following Jesus, and I went through suffering during that season. And now I look back, even, suffering recently, and it's just interesting to see the different ways I approached, these circumstances based on where I was in life. And there was times where I allowed it to completely shake everything I believed in. Then there were times where I tried to just go through it on my own and find my own ways of, self-medicating and pulling myself through it. And then recently, in the last few years, having to go through, difficulty with sickness in the family and life-threatening stuff, and having to basically get up every day and still answer this call of, am I going to be faithful in the middle of it? Like, am I going to pray for people to be healed when I'm not seeing healing in my home? Am I going to walk away from ministry? Am I going to walk away from what God's called me to do because I'm not seeing what I'm expecting him to do in my life?
Yeah.
And it's funny. I was thinking back to in high school, my first 2 years of high school football, I played for a team where we lost almost every single game in the season. Maybe we won 2, and we shouldn't have won those either. And I mean, and not a little, sometimes 60-6, horrible. But I look back now, I'm like, man, God was actually even using that to teach me about life. Hey, are you still going to run the plays even when the scoreboard is unreachable?
Yeah.
And I remember sometimes those games would end and I'd be bawling we lost by 1 point. And I'm thinking back later on, there was no way we could have won that game. But I've learned in that season, or I was being taught in that season, how to be faithful when it doesn't look possible, and how to be faithful even though you don't think you can win in the natural, just because God's called you to do it. And I think at a church called Victory, it's really easy for us to sometimes highlight all I do is win stuff and forget about victory. A lot of times comes through suffering. It comes through pain. It comes through loss. And what does it look like? Sometimes the victory is the fact that you're just still following God on the other side of it.
That's really good.
Still standing.
Yeah.
And I think that's what God's taught me in this season is sometimes victory doesn't look at all like what I was asking God to do. Sometimes victory is the fact that I'm still following God.
Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Has that affected any of your relationships or just even how you interact with people to know that? I mean, when you work in ministry, the salvation is the win, right? We introduce someone to Jesus and Jesus captured their heart, but remaining faithful is the win.
Yeah.
And sticking through it. And so having that testimony, how has that affected your walk with other people?
I think for people that have been through or going through suffering and pain, it's been incredibly life-giving for those people.
Yeah.
For people who haven't, it's a bit of a buzzkill. They're I don't want to hear about your story. Yeah. Who invited that guy to the party? But being able to still laugh and smile and have relationships in the middle of that, and to show people, hey, you can still minister and you can still follow God, even, after losing a child, even after having families fall apart. You can go through pain and still love God. And what I've learned too is I'm drawn to people who've been through suffering, and I'm looking at that saying of I want a leader who kind of walks with a limp.
Yeah.
Someone who's bled a little bit, because if they haven't been through pain, I'm almost wondering hey, has your faith really been tested?
Yeah.
I don't know what you're made of yet.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for people who've been through some pain and they're still loving Jesus and they're still staying married and they're still raising their kids, because I need that kind of consistency. People who are anchored in life, know what they believe, and have been through some storms and they're still there.
Yeah.
And so I think when you're that kind of person, you draw real people to you because you're real,
Mhm.
and you find out what people are really made of, and they find out what you're made of. But you're also going to sometimes, people who are just looking for a good time are going to keep on walking by because it's like, hey, I'm just looking for the 30-second highlight reel. I don't want to know the real story. And so, that's how it's impacted.
That's something, though, that I've really appreciated in our current culture is that we're starting to normalize that life is not all sunshine and rainbows. We're starting to acknowledge that trauma is real and that there's impacts of that, and that sometimes you have a bad day, and that's okay. And I always laugh at you ever just go check out a new church and you walk in and there's just that jolly guy at the front. How in heaven are you? Like he's just having a great day. And I'm like, do you mean that? Like, is that real? And I think normalizing that it's not all sunshine and rainbows speaks such bigger volumes than, oh yeah, I've been a Christian my whole life and my life's been perfect and Jesus has me. Yeah, that could be true that Jesus has you, but sometimes that's tough. I personally went through, this year has been the hardest mental health year of my life. At the beginning of the year, I had to disappear from my world for 2 months. For 8 weeks, I sheltered in place in my home, and I had a full-on mental breakdown, and I was unwell, very unwell. It took very intentional time with the Lord to unpack all of the things that I didn't address from my childhood, from my adolescence, from my early adulthood, and giving it that time and that space was so life-giving. And what I have found out, that this thing that I was not even necessarily ashamed to admit that existed, but more of, I didn't even want to acknowledge, I'm fine. I'm a fully functioning adult. I don't need to acknowledge that. What's the point? Well, the point is that someday it comes cascading down, and then you have to.
Yeah.
And for me, I did. And taking the seed analogy even further, I have a great friend that she sells plants for a living, and she's fantastic. And she gave me a plant when I was going through that 8 weeks, and we affectionately named it my trauma plant. And yep. So it's a really tough plant. Like I love plants, but this one is a tough one to keep alive. But it's got really big leaves, and it's got some really finicky needs. And I'm not about that. But what I found is that while I'm caring for this plant, it's showing what's happening in me. It had these big, beautiful leaves on it, and they started to, very shortly after I got it, I was like, is this my fault? But they started to die. They started to curl and turn brown. And I'm like, no, not the big mature leaves. But what I noticed is that when I cut them, new growth almost immediately started to grow.
Oh, wow.
And the way I took that, and the invitation that I felt the Lord inviting me into, was this big, beautiful, mature leaf that you think represents who you are and your personality and your story. Some of that has to go so that new growth can come through.
That's good. Yeah.
And that big, beautiful leaf is not defining who you are. But until we chop that off, we're not going to see what's underneath. And now that it's been 6 months since I cut all those off, I was just looking at it this morning. Good morning, trauma plant. I talked to it. And but there are these new leaves that I was just out of town last week, and there's these new leaves that just came out this morning, and it's exciting to see and to know that I am growing, and it's not going to look like what I always anticipated that it would, but what's there is beautiful if I would just take the time and the patience to watch for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been, I recommend it. Get a trauma plant.
I
Let
would-
it
mine
talk to
doesn't
you.
I'm not
stand
good with plants.
I'm a plant assassin.
Listen, I thought
I would not
the
be
same.
able to do it.
I thought the same, but you gotta start small. Maybe you could do
Maybe a
it.
pansy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
There was one word you said is patience that
Yeah.
Yes.
really stuck out to me. And I
Yeah.
think that when we go through suffering, we want to go through it quick. We don't want to stay in it and to understand what God is trying to teach us in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, I'm guilty for that.
Yeah.
I'm just like, God, I don't want to go through this.
Yeah.
Like, I already been there, done, and dealt with it, or at least I thought I dealt with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like when you don't have time to prune those things, they do circle
Yep.
right back around. It's just another cycle that keeps going and going around, and you keep going through it. until you allow God to actually deal with
Yeah.
your heart,
Yep.
to actually take you through it so he can refine you. And then on the other side, you're like, oh, it's like the Band-Aid.
Yep.
It wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
I'm better now.
Yeah.
So I think it's really just making sure we have patience and just to trust God of what we're going through and not run from it. I think also having a good group around you too,
Mm.
that you
Community
could be
matters.
held
Yeah.
accountable for. Because sometimes when we are going through things of suffering, we can easily isolate ourselves.
Mhm.
We can withdraw away from people. But if you don't have people who are also on that side where you can talk to or push you through it, you can easily kind of back out of the suffering
Yeah.
God is trying to take you to and isolate you, which is it's not good.
Yeah.
Well, and do you ever find that it's like in layers, and so you think you've dealt with it, and then oh, there's another
Yes.
layer,
Yeah.
and then
Oh,
there's
yeah.
another layer.
Yes. I was even after 10 years, more than 10 years, came to Christ in 2010, so 14 years. Even after 14 years of walking with Christ, the stuff I thought I had dealt with is not gone.
Yeah.
And I realized that I went through Ford experience, and I'm just like, okay, God, I thought I already dealt with this.
Uh-huh.
And he's like, no, that's why you're going
Yeah.
through Ford experience to get all of this junk out.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think we don't realize until we handle those things, then God can't open certain doors for us because we're so steadily holding on to stuff that we need to release to
Yeah.
Him.
And I think when
Yeah.
you go through it though in isolation, I was thinking about that. I was like, well, one, you could be missing out on other people who've already been through it who can help
Yeah.
you, and other people are missing out on like you could actually give this pain and this suffering some purpose by
Purpose.
sharing it with
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
and letting them walk through and like comforting and allowing yourself to be comforted. And so that's really a challenge for me because I do tend to
Mhm.
try to I'm gonna circle the wagons and just go through it by myself, and I'll call people when I'm on the other side of it versus saying like, hey, can you help me? That's probably the hardest thing is
Yeah.
asking for help
Yeah.
in the
Mhm.
middle of it.
Yeah, I do think that a lot of times the suffering is prolonged just because we're unwilling to ask for help,
Mhm.
right? And so it's
That's
like the
good.
situation that you were saying with your son, like, hey, it's not going to hurt that much. I
Yeah.
promise you. Trust me. Right. So I've had to have those seasons where it's like I've went on a cycle over and over and over again. I'm like, when is this thing going to end? I think you've been saying something around the lines like temporary. You don't
Yeah.
know when it's going to end,
Mhm.
but temporary could be long or short.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But if I can get out of that temporary faster by just asking somebody, that's
Mhm.
exactly what I'm going to do. And I think that's how I've grown doing like hardships and trials and tribulations. Like I've learned to lean on others. Like
Mhm.
you went through it
Mm.
and you overcame it. Like what did you do? What has God done for you? Talk to me.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes it's just having somebody just to talk to,
Yeah.
and it will help you. And so
Real.
I think talking to people is a
Mhm.
really good way to go through it
Mhm.
and to get out of it sometimes. Right?
I agree. That's why this is so important.
Yeah.
Doing this together, doing life together, talking about the real topics of parenting and being a son, a middle child. And
Yeah.
it matters. Your story matters. It matters to God. It matters to your community. And so I appreciate the open dialogue and your vulnerability. Thank you guys.
Of course.
We'll continue doing it.
I'll
Yep.
do it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome.
So.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.